So today, I'm going to talk about David. Bless you. Today I'm going to talk about David. David is our next stop, probably our final stop. I haven't decided that for sure, in kind of what we call the Faith of Our Fathers series, where we're kind of stepping through the big, stepping through the story in the Old Testament, especially looking at through the lens of the people that God made a covenant with, but just the overarching, like what's going on in the Old Testament, because it has everything to do with what the apostles and disciples of Jesus wrote, followers of Jesus wrote in the New Testament, and you can't quite get what they're saying without it. So, David today. But first, just kind of last time on Faith of Our Fathers, previous episode. Here's where we've gone, right? God created the heavens and earth in the beginning, and he wanted to partner with humans, with all of humanity, to rule this creation. Which partnering, when he defines it, he's talking about bringing life and order and beauty to this world, right? Because he is the source of all that, and he wants to bring that through us. The humans in the story, they decided to reject this partnership. They wanted to do it on their own terms, rule on their own terms, and there were consequences, dire consequences to that. But at the same time, God promises that there will come a day where there'll be this time when this human will come who will defeat evil in the world, but he's going to sacrifice himself in the process. The poem says that the seed of the woman will strike the head of the snake, but the snake will strike the heel of the seed. And so then it goes on from there. They're exiled from this wonderful garden place and into this world of death and decay. And more of that happens. And the world just descends into these cycles of ruin and chaos and violence. And God finally decides to complete the destruction of this already ruined world through this flood, this cataclysm. But he saves one family. And he decides unilaterally after that he's never going to do that again. He's not going to just destroy the whole place again. And he doesn't ask for any promises in return. This is the next step in him committing himself to us. But this humanity 1.1 still has the same bugs as the 1.0 version. Still has the same problems. We see that Noah has his own failure. His sons have their own failure. And things start spiraling again. And a group of people in Babylon decide to make this tower to reach up to the heaven. It's them wanting to be like God. And they want to exalt themselves. And so God decides to wreck that plan and scatters them throughout the land by causing them to suddenly start speaking in like Chinese and Aramaic and whatever else was going on at the time, which would be really confusing. But then, out of this scattering of Babylon, God decides to select one man and his wife to bless them, but it's so that through them, the rest of humanity, the rest of the families of the world will receive the blessing, the Eden blessing that he wanted all along. What he wanted all along for Adam and Eve. And now he's going to bring it through Abraham and Sarah to the rest of the world. And so over many generations, this human pair grow into kind of a large family, a large people group, and they end up enslaved in Egypt. And God rescues them out of there and takes them back to the land that he promised to give Abraham, their ancestor. And on the way, he establishes this special partnership, a covenant, the Bible calls it, with that people group. And he wants them to be his special representatives to the rest of humanity. He says, I want you to be a kingdom of priests, like a whole nation that are going to represent me to the rest of the world, he says. And I'm going to just pause here and point out, so everybody in this room, I know you pretty well, I'm pretty sure, pretty confident that you're all believe as I do regarding what's going on in the world, who's the real king of the world, all that stuff. But I say this especially for anybody that maybe not agreeing with that or not sure, or maybe listening online or maybe listening sometime later, that regardless of whether you believe this right now or not, it's really remarkable how the history of the Hebrew people group was affected, especially by the Exodus and the time in the wilderness, the covenant at Mount Sinai. I heard one person put it this way: somebody stuck the fork in the socket. Like, it changed their history forever. This people group and their history was affected from remarkable, thousands of years later. They still, through all the things that they've been through, persecution, ancient and modern, they encountered a being out there that wrecked them for anything else. In spite of all their failings, in spite of all the ups and downs, the betrayals, the returns, the overall arc of their story has been forever changed by what happened out there. And as many of you, as all of you in this room, as many of you listening, so have I. So have we stuck stuck the fork in the like socket. Or at least that is my if you haven't yet, that's what needs to happen. It's one thing to maybe you've heard stories of this God. You've heard rumors of that he's a friend to those that are downcast, that he's a healer, that he's a protector. And you need to know that all the stories are true. And I'd invite you to stick the fork in the like socket too. Anyway, I know you guys in the room here are with me, but I just feel like I just wanted to say that for anybody who may be listening at some point who's not, or who's on the fence about it. So they encounter God in the wilderness, and eventually they make it into the promised land. We talked about Moses and some of what he went through. And they take over from the previous inhabitants. They run them out, mostly. They settle in. And from then on, they kept up their partnership with God and lived happily ever after. Not exactly. It would be nice if that was the case. Then we get to the book of Judges. There's these cycles in the book of Judges where people turn to follow other gods, the Baals and the Ashtoreths and these names of gods that are around there, gods of the surrounding peoples. And then, God kind of pulls back, and so the natural things happens, which is they get oppressed and persecuted by their enemies, and then they repent of that and they cry out to God for deliverance, and God raises up a leader. The book calls them, our English translation calls them judges. I mean, they're not just, it's not like a judge on a, that we would think of in a court. They do make decisions on interpreting the law, but they're also like military leaders and all these other things. And so God raised up these judges and deliver them from the persecution through these people, and that there'd be peace in the land, usually just as long as the judge is alive, and then the cycle starts all over again. And there's six major ones mentioned in the book of Judges. And then the final set of narratives, they're pretty disturbing, especially the very last one. This is after Samson. Samson's the last of these six major judges that are mentioned. It's pretty bad. Especially there's a story about a man and his concubine, and man, it turns my stomach every time I read it. And it's hyperlinked to, like, use the same phrases and stuff from the stories at Sodom and Gomorrah when the angels go down there to check it out, and ends in the same thing, by the entire tribe of Benjamin, every person of a certain age, every male of a certain age and above, wiped out, because the Israelites are finally like, we can't, this is an abomination that we can't allow to just continue. And then they try to find a way to, kind of resurrect that tribe. But the point of the stories in Judges is just that there's no change, and things are keep cycling on this. Go serve God for a while, away, back, away. But each time it's like worse, until they end in this spot where they're like no better than Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, it's pretty bad. And the last line, the very last verse, in those days there was no king in Israel. Each one did what was right in his own eyes. Very last verse. Next book is Samuel. And Samuel, I'm not going to go into the story of Samuel. He is kind of actually the last judge, right? He's the seventh major judge and he's a good guy. He's way better than Samson and Gideon and Jephthah as far as like following the Lord. And he is a righteous man. He's doing right, but at some point he's getting older. His kids, they're not the same. They're not good guys, and so the people are like, we don't like this, and so they want a king. They don't want to go back into this cycle, and they say to Samuel, "Give us a king." Say, your kids, they're not good guys, and we want a strong leader, and so give us a king. We want to be like everybody else around us. And God's not happy. Samuel's not happy, and he prays to God about it, and God says, look, don't take it personally. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Why is God upset about this? Actually, in Deuteronomy, Moses gives instructions like, hey, when you guys get a king, here's what you should do. Here's how this king should be. He should be a Bible nerd. He shouldn't have massive military, and he shouldn't have lots of wives. And he shouldn't go back to Egypt. So, like, is God against the king? No. But it's kind of the reason that they're asking is what he doesn't like. He says to Samuel, look, they're rejecting me. They've been this way since the wilderness. They're always wandering away. And we get a hint into exactly what's going on, that when Samuel, he tells Samuel, hey, just go with it, give them what they want, but just warn them like what a king's going to be like, which mainly his warning has to do with taxes. Taxes and the draft, right? He says, look, I'll give you a king, but he's going to tax you, he's going to take your sons to serve in the military, and your daughters into, to be servants in his household, and so they're like, we don't care, we want a king anyway, and this time they elaborate a little bit, and this is the key here. They say we want to be like the rest of the nations. They already said that last time, and we want a king that will rule us and go out before us and fight our battles. So, like, what was the problem? What's the problem in Israel's in Judges? They're always getting persecuted by and oppressed by these nations around them. So they want a king that'll go out there and fight their battles for them. But what's the diagnosis of the author of Judges? What's that? God is supposed to be the one. And he says, yeah, exactly. And he says specifically, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Like the problem is they're not trusting God. They're abandoning the covenant. And so God is handing them over to oppression. Like what they need to do is follow the covenant and God will fight their battles. But they don't want to do that. And so they're being oppressed. But they think the solution is going to be get us a king. They're not seeing what's going on. But God says that's okay. That's what they want. And he instructs Samuel to give them what they want. So, the very next chapter, right after what we just read, Saul is introduced. This is the very first time we hear about Saul. 1 Samuel 9. There was a man from Benjamin whose name was Kish, a son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of all those guys, you get it. A very wealthy man. Very wealthy. He had a son whose name was Saul, young and handsome. There was not a man from among the Israelites more handsome than he was. He was a good-looking fellow. From his shoulders up, he was taller than all the people. These are the first words we hear about Saul. One thing you got to know about the narrators in the Bible is that the first thing they mention about a character is important. And usually they leave details out. You don't know what any of these people look like, but if they mention it, it's important. And Saul was a good-looking fellow, probably a smart dresser. He's tall, he's young, he's rich. His dad was rich, so he was rich. Sounds like a good choice for a king, huh? And God says to Samuel, yeah, go anoint this guy. But God ends up rejecting Saul as king. Because Saul just won't do as he's told. It's some major failings. And I'll have some more to say about that later. But God says, do this. Saul doesn't do it. God says, do this other thing. Saul, once again, doesn't do it. So God ends up rejecting Saul. Says, you don't get to be king no more. And Samuel says to Saul, when he gives him this news, he says that Yahweh has found himself someone after his own heart. A phrase we all probably pretty familiar with when used to describe David, because he's referring to David. So Yahweh's gone and found himself somebody that is like he is in his heart. So Samuel gets really bummed. He's kind of depressed about this whole thing with Saul just ending terribly. And then God says, look, stop being depressed. Get up, grab your oil, which I guess he had laying around, and go to Bethlehem, and I'm going to have you anoint the next king there. So he goes. And he gets, God told him it was going to be one of the sons of Jesse, so he makes up an excuse to have Jesse and them around at this feast where they offer sacrifices and stuff. And then he says, hey, by the way, I'm here to anoint one of your kids as king. Bring them over. And you guys know the story. All the sons pass before him. The first guy, the oldest, Samuel's like, man, a strapping young lad. surely this is God's anointed right here in front of me. This is the guy. And in a famous verse, God says, no. Man looks at outward appearances, but I look on the heart. Don't look at this guy. I've rejected him. He's not the guy. So Samuel's, all right. You know the story. All of them, like 8 kids, all come. That's it. None of them. And don't you have any more kids? Oh yeah, there's the youngest, the littlest. They forgot to invite him to the party. He's still out in the field. I don't know how long it took to go fetch him. They must have waited a while. But Samuel's like, we're not leaving until we settle this today. So they go fetch him. And yeah, God says, this is the guy. It's David. And so he anoints him. So here's a good example, a good time to point out this pattern that God has of selecting the person you wouldn't expect, especially because we have our own idea of who should have, authority or power. It's usually the tallest, the strongest, the better looking, the smartest, the whatever. And God loves to just upset the apple cart and say, nah, I have a different value set of who's, and he loves to exalt the lowest first. He does that with Abel over Cain. He does that with Shem over Japheth, Noah's kids. Isaac over Ishmael. Jacob over Esau. Joseph over Reuben. Judah over Reuben. Moses over Aaron. I could go on. I could really go on for a long time. And here's one of the more famous examples of it, where he says, "Nah, it's the young one out there." Now, the thing you got to know is that God isn't playing favorites. Like, I just want I want the oldest to be put in his place. But he does have this pattern of telling us, right? This is what these stories are telling us, that he has a different value set. This is why Jesus knows that the last will be first. It's not just something that the Father or the Spirit whispered in his ear. He read his Bible. And it's not because there's not something for the oldest too, right? God says to Cain, if you do good, there'll be exaltation for you too. You just got to wait your turn. And just because you're oldest doesn't mean you're first. That's all it is. It's not that what's actually the case is that there's enough honor for everybody. God isn't saying there's only some and I'm going to give it to the youngest. He just says, you guys like to say that the oldest is the strongest and the smartest and the best looking is the guy. I like to point out that you're all important, so I start with the lowest guy. And if you're the guy that's the strongest or the best looking or whatever, that'll be a time of testing for you. That's the pattern we see in the Bible. And I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in the lives of people around me. So, now, does that mean that David fell out of the ugly tree and hit every branch on the way down? No. He's good looking too. It's one of the first things we hear about him. That he's ruddy, not a word we use a lot, but it just means he has color in his skin. He's not pale. And he's young, beautiful eyes. It says that. Very handsome. He's good looking too. Okay. Why? Well, remember, God does not look on the outside, looks at the heart. These two guys were both decent looking fellas, but it's the heart. And that's why David was chosen. And again, one of the first things we hear about the character is important, and his good looks get him in trouble later. But we'll get to that in a minute. To some degree, the rest you already know. But that ends up being a problem for him later. It foreshadows some of the struggles that he'll have, like with Bathsheba and stuff. But David's a mixed bag, just like the rest of us. Just like Abraham, just like Noah, just like Moses, just like me, just like you. We do some things good, other things not so good. The best thing I have going for me is that God's really committed to me, even when I mess up. That's my saving grace. And so, yeah, no surprise that David is a mixed bag as well. So, Samuel, the book, and it's one scroll in the Hebrew Bible, but it's kind of long, so they divide it up into two in Christian Bibles. But it traces the arc of these two kings, and kind of there's some comparison and contrasting, right, of Saul's rise and fall, and David's rise and fall eventually. And so, yeah, we're not going to cover it all. Not going to cover everything the Bible has to say about David. Not even going to cover everything Samuel has to say about David. But I do want to highlight a few things, touch down on a couple more things before we kind of land on the thought that I want to leave us with today. You guys with me? Okay. Sounds like I need to ask you more often. So the first thing I want to point out is this here. And let's read it first. This is when David is bringing up the ark. He wanted to have the ark close to him. It was somewhere else, right? The tabernacle and the ark inside it were over in Gibeah, I think. I forget where. Shiloh, one of those places. There's a couple places where the ark was there for a long time, and I get them mixed up. But it was somewhere else. He's like, I want God's presence close to me. He tries to bring it over. It goes poorly. The guy dies because they weren't following the instructions. They're in the Torah of how to transport the ark. He finds out that, so they had to stop midway on the journey and leave it somewhere. He finds out that guy, they left it at his house, he's getting blessed like crazy. All his sheep are coming out great, all his camels, all his donkeys, his grain, and David's like, okay, I want me some of that. And so he's like, all right, when he hears about it, this is where we pick up the story. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom, that's the guy, to the city of David with jubilation. And it happened that when the carriers of the ark of Yahweh had marched 6 steps, this guy is carrying it on poles, when they'd marched 6 steps, that he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Now, when David was dancing with all his might before Yahweh, and David was wearing a linen ephod. He wasn't naked or in his underwear. I like to joke that he was because of some later verses, but that's not what was going on. That was something that Michal was his wife was being sarcastic. It's a turn of phrase about the dancing because you're making a fool of yourself, and she uses a turn of phrase that they had. You're uncovering yourself. But he wasn't in his underwear. He was wearing a linen ephod. The ephod is a priestly garment. Priests are supposed to wear ephods. From the tribe of Levi, from the line of Aaron, of which David was neither. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of Yahweh with shouts of joyful acclaim and with the sound of the trumpet. It goes on. They brought the ark of Yahweh and set it in its place in the middle of the tent which David had pitched for. He put a tent up there in Jerusalem. Then David offered up burnt offerings and fellowship offerings in the presence of Yahweh. When David had finished from the sacrifices of the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of Yahweh of hosts. Then he distributed to all the people, to the whole multitude of Israel, from man to woman, to each one ring-shaped piece of bread, 1 cake of dates, 1 cake of raisins, and all the people went to his house. Then David goes to bless his household. He's doing several priestly things here. Offering the sacrifices, not necessarily. I mean, everybody offers a sacrifice. Usually that means you go and the priest is offering it on your behalf. It's said that you offered it because you were the one that put up the animal, but you're not the actual one performing the rite. But he is wearing this ephod. He is blessing all the people, right? Think in Numbers when the priestly blessing is given to Aaron. This is how you will bless the people. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine. You know the verses. David's doing that. And then he's given out all this food because he wants it to be a time of joyous celebration. And I heard somebody make this observation, and I think they're on something. In Genesis, the humans in the garden are portrayed as having prophetic duties. That's speaking God's word to others, right? They're walking in the garden every day, communing with God, and then they're supposed to go out and put that out into the world. Priestly duties, which is representing people before God, right? So if this is God, this is the people, the prophet is facing this way, telling the people what God is saying. The priest is facing this way, right? He's interceding on behalf of the people to God. And they had royal duties, right? Rule and rule the earth, subdue it. And it's like after the fall, those three things are kind of become split or fractured. There's not any human that does all three described in the Bible after that. Like we get some that have 2 out of 3, like Melchizedek is a priest and a king. Moses is a kind of a prophet and a priest. But here we have David, and he's a king, but he's also doing these priestly duties. And it just highlights him as one of these figures that is really getting close to what God wants for all of humanity. And it's foreshadowing. Man, he made it close. He's not the seed of the woman, the long promised, long awaited seed, but he made it close. I guess we'll have to keep waiting. We'll have to keep reading. And Jesus, spoiler alert, fulfills all three: prophet, priest, and king. So the next thing I want to talk about, just because this is like the pinnacle of David's in the story of his story arc, right? This is where he's at his best. It's kind of a little bit downhill from here for him. He starts running into trouble, but this is the top of his rise. He's brought the ark in. He's defeated his enemies. God's brought him rest all around, and he calls up one of the prophets, and he's like, I've noticed I have this nice house, but like God's presence is in this, kind of run-down looking tent or something. I don't know. It's the Coventon paraphrase. He's just in a tent, right? Versus a nice cedar stone building. And the prophet says, yeah, you do whatever you want, man. But then God speaks to the prophet and says, not exactly, go tell David this. And that's where I want to read the whole thing again here, just because this is so important. Try not to get your eyes glassed over, just because it's a long passage. It's really important. It happened that night, the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, that's the prophet, saying, go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, are you the one to build me a house for my dwelling? For I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites from Egypt until this day. Rather, I was going about in a tent and in a tabernacle, quite happy. In all of my going about among the Israelites, did I ever say to one of the tribes of Israel with whom I commanded my shepherd, commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why did you not build me a cedar house? He says, did I ever complain? This whole time, it's been, I don't know, a couple centuries probably. This whole time, I've been fine. Did I ever complain? No. But then he says, so, then, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be a leader over my people, over Israel. And I've been with you everywhere you went. And I have cut off all your enemies from in front of you. And I will make a great name for you, as the name of the great ones who are on the earth. He's not upset that David had this idea, but he is pointing out that that he's okay. But he's not upset about it. In fact, he starts giving these promises to David. I'll make a great name for you. Verse 10, I'll make a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can dwell in their own place. This is Eden language, right? Plant the people in the garden. Plant Israel in the land. They will not tremble any longer, and the children of wickedness will not afflict them again, as in the former days, referring to all those episodes with the judges. Then he finishes with this. In the manner that I appointed the judges over my people Israel, I will give you, David, rest from all your enemies. And Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will build a house for you. It's play on words, house as in family, household, right? You say you want me to build me a house? No, I'm going to build you a house. When your days are full and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up from your offspring after you, who will go out from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. He says, that guy gets to build a house, your son. I will be a father to him. He's adopting David's line as his son. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son for me, whom I will punish when he does wrong with the rod of men and with blows of human beings. But my loyal love shall not depart from him as I took it from Saul, from whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. This is massive. This is massive. And man, it's worth a long walk or a cup of tea or coffee or whatever your favorite meditation beverage might be. David had an idea. He said, God, I want to do something for you. What do you give the person who has everything? I don't know, but you try it anyway. He says, I'm going to build this house for you. And God says, I'm okay, but you know what I want to do, I really appreciate it. And what I want to do is I'm going to build a house for you. I want to adopt your line as my son. And I'm not going to, he doesn't say if, he says when. When they abandon me, I'm not going to abandon them like I did Saul. I might teach him a lesson, but I'm not going to abandon. Those words loyal love translate Hebrew chesed, which is the covenantal love, right? It's a word that love, loyal love, covenantal love are kind of our English approximations, but it's that love, the love of the covenant, that loyal kind of, yeah. And that last verse especially, an eternal kingdom established forever. that becomes like the source of hope for the prophets later, and the exiles, right? They're like, yeah, and they all start riffing on it and hearing the Lord speak more about it and writing poems about it. There's an eternal kingdom. How's that going to happen? We're in exile. What has the Lord been promising? And they start tying that to this seed, and all this stuff is going on. And that's David at his height, and it's a real important kind of development in the Bible story. But after that, he starts having problems. There's a whole episode with Bathsheba where he sees somebody else's wife, decides to get him killed accidentally because he got her pregnant. There's consequences to that are immediate and some that play out later in his family. Very dysfunctional family. His kids are all at each other's throats, doing stuff that's whacked. David is not really doing much about it. Just letting them do what they're doing. And it's pretty messed up. Eventually, it kind of gets straightened out. Then, much later, towards the end, or closer anyway, to the end of his life, David has this idea of doing a census of the army. And everybody's like, no, don't do that. Which seems kind of weird to us, like, oh, what's wrong with that? The subtext that the authors tell you is like, no, he was doing it because he didn't trust God. Who's supposed to fight the battles? God is. Just because you have a standing army, does that mean you're fighting the battles? Or is God actually doing it? No, it's still actually God. That's what's supposed to be the way it works. But if you're counting up your army with that mindset of I want to know what my strength is, whether or not I can do this or that, attack or defend this or that, it's because you're not trusting God. That's where David's heart was. And so his generals tell him, no, let's not do this. And he says, no, dang it, I'm the king and I want them counted. So like, all right, you're the boss. And they go and count all the men. 800,000. That's a men of fighting age. And then David realizes, man, that was a dumb thing to do. And he repents. And he says, forgive me, Lord. And so God sends a prophet named Gad. And he tells him, go speak to David. Thus says Yahweh, giving you a choice between three things as far as being able to. You want me to forgive you? Here's how the guilt is taken away. One of these three things. Choose one of them. And he says, verse 13, 7 years of famine in the land, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they chase you, or 3 days of pestilence. Pestilence is a way of saying God's own wrath or punishment. It's what's described in the wilderness stories, right? What happens when they go, the golden calf or the Baal of Peor or all those stories, right? It talks about there being a plague or a pestilence. It means they all just start keeling over because God is bringing some disease or something. It's kind of a little vague what it is, but that's what this is referring to. The 3 days of pestilence. Now consider and decide what I must return to the one who sent me, says Gad. What would you guys choose? I remember, I grew up in church, and there's a lot of the Bible stories that I don't remember when the first time I heard them, because I just heard them at such a young age. And there's some stories that tell kids that I definitely hadn't heard. This one is, I could have heard it. I mean, it's not like, rated R or whatever, but I didn't. I remember reading this for the first time, not knowing what he was going to choose. And I remember thinking, what would I choose? And my first thought was, well, definitely not number 3. The God's own wrath. Like I've read the story about Sodom and Gomorrah. I've read the stories about, the guys getting swallowed up by the earth. Like, that one's straight out. Whichever one I would choose, it would be one of the other two. So imagine my surprise. But the logic makes sense. But imagine my surprise when David says, man, nature and people, they'll just be heartless. But God, man, there's a chance he'll have mercy. I'm going with the 3 days of wrath. My paraphrase. The 3 days. He alludes to he is great. Great is his compassion. That's a reference to Exodus 34, 6 and 7, the most quoted verse in the Old Testament. And so, yeah, that's what David picks. And straight away, it happens. It starts happening. Yahweh sent a plague into Israel from the morning until the agreed time. And everybody is affected. Dan to Beersheba is a way of saying, from Bismarck to South Padre or whatever, right? Like the whole the whole country. And then the angel was stretching out his hand to destroy Jerusalem. But Yahweh regretted about the bad, the evil that he had said. And he says to the angel, stop. And then David sees his chance. And he says, look, I'm the one who messed up here. Like, these people they're just following my lead. They shouldn't be punished. Please let your hand be against me and my house. He's willing to give up the thing that God had promised him. Does that remind you of anything? What about Moses, the golden calf? When he says, God, if you please forgive him, but if you can't, blot me out from. Only Moses was innocent. David wasn't. But still, he's saying, he's taking responsibility. So here's where I want to talk about a little bit what Saul does and what David does. One of the things that God told Saul to do was to, before you go out to war, wait. Samuel's going to show up, do a sacrifice, then you can go to war against those people. You'll defeat them. Samuel takes his time getting there. Saul gets impatient, and he offers to sacrifice himself. And of course, Samuel gets there like the next second. As soon as he offers a sacrifice, Samuel shows up. But Saul's, when Samuel confronts him about it, Saul says, well, people were leaving, and I was like afraid what was going to happen, and so I forced myself to do it. I didn't want to, but I forced myself to do it because everybody was leaving. Later on, God tells him to wipe out these people that had preyed on them back during the wilderness, and to not keep any of the cattle. He goes and wipes them out, but he keeps the cattle. And Samuel confronts him about it, and Saul says, well, the people, they wanted the cattle, and I was going to offer him as a sacrifice anyway. He's always passing the buck. He's always saying the circumstances forced me to do it. He's always saying, well, I wanted to, but they didn't want to, so I went with them. I didn't have a choice. Not so David. David doesn't always realize his mistake. He did hear, and then he took responsibility. And the thing with Bathsheba, it took the prophet confronting him pretty strongly before he repented, but he did repent. It's a huge difference. Huge difference. So, in the rest of the Bible, I have one example here of just how David is talked about in the rest of the Bible. And one thing you gotta, so in the Hebrew Bible, the books of what we call the Pentateuch are called the Torah, right? And then Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12, what we call minor prophets. That chunk is called the prophets. Even the books that we call history, they call the prophets. Because this isn't like just a historical, then this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Those histories are like a prophetic retelling of what was really going on, right? That's why those statements like everyone did what was right in their own eyes or things like that, right? Where the authors are retelling, this is what happened, but this is why and what was really going on. And they're kind of like a prophetic, from God's perspective of their history. And when God tells their history from his perspective, always talks about David in the highest of terms. Always. Every king in the book of Kings after is compared to David. Here's one example where Jeroboam, the king that got the kingship of 10 of the tribes from Solomon when the kingdom split, and the first thing he did is tell them all to worship some other god, and he just went, straight into the ditch immediately. And later in his life, he was in trouble, and he wanted to know if he was going to die or not. And so he sends his wife to go inquire of a prophet, but she dresses up to try to, anyway, it's this whole thing. God, the prophet says to the wife, "Go tell Jeroboam, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, because I raised you." And he goes on to say, man, I gave you all this stuff. But you, verse 8, were not like my servant David, who kept my commandments and who went after me with all his heart, to do only what is right in my eyes. Does that sound like the story we just read? Or that I just talked about? To do only what was right in my eyes? Kept my commandments? But consistently, this is just one of a couple dozen probably examples I could give you. It's always compared to David. All the kings. Yep, he was like David. He wasn't like David. He was like David, but not exactly. Some of them are like that. I think Hezekiah is the only one who's like, yep, he's almost like another David. But the rest are like, he's horrible. He's not like David, or he is like David, except not with his whole heart, because he did 90%, but not 100% like David. And, to say nothing of the Psalms and all the other things. This is how David is depicted. This is how, in retrospect, in the prophetic retelling of history, what's going on? Why? Is it just because they like David and is this propaganda from the later authors? Danny Silk a pastor. I think he's still a pastor at Bethel in Redding, California. I heard him preaching one time about David, and he says David's always trying to reach out and grab God by the relationship in all his troubles. And it kind of stuck with me as a phrase. Whatever he's going through, he's always trying to get back to God. Whereas Saul was making excuses, David was still trying to follow. When he was mess up, he's still trying to reconcile. Psalm 51, a beautiful poem about how he's just wrecked under his sin, but he wants reconciliation. I think that's the difference. I think that's the difference, that his face was towards God. That's what God saw in him. Like, here's a guy who's going to follow after me with his whole heart. Even when he stumbles, even when he messes up, and when he turns aside, he's going to get back up. And when he realizes his mistake, he's not going to say, it's too late, I guess I'll give up. Or I don't want to do it. Or I can't. No, he's always trying to find a way. Trying to find a way to get back to God. Trying to find a way to reconcile. Trying to find a way to do what God wants him to do. And that trust is what God sees. It's like, here's someone. And that's the thought that I want to leave you with. That we would be those people always. That would follow hard after God. That would be said of you that you followed with your whole heart. Even when the people that really know, you're like, man, he did a lot of bad stuff. She did a lot of wacky things. No. It didn't matter, because in the end you got back up. And this goes for the victories too. You know, as I was writing this, I was thinking about, there's a poem, Rudyard Kipling, called If. And he's talking about the hard things you got to do as an adult. And one of the things that he says is, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. He's pointing out something that Ecclesiastes is pointing out, like the highs and the lows, like they're still like vapor. They're still imposters. That's not the thing. The thing is following God. He says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the thing. Following after God no matter what. Speaking of Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18 says that he clung to Yahweh. He held fast. That's how we should be. The highs, the lows, the failures, the successes. Cling to God. Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Moses said, look, God, if you're not going to go with us, then don't bring us up from here. He says, I'd rather stay in this horrible, dry wilderness than go to this land of plenty without you. Like, if you stay here, I'm staying here. So, will you be a person who follows God with your whole heart? I urge you, I invite you to commit yourself or recommit yourself or refocus on that. That's the thing. Just always pointed towards him. And as soon as you realize you're not, look around, find him, keep going. And realize that a lot of times it'll be his spirit telling you that, and just as many times it'll be somebody around you. And you need to listen. Don't make an excuse like Saul, but actually listen. It'll be the most rewarding thing you do. I guarantee it. Where you'll find meaning in your life. To follow with your whole heart, to grab God by the relationship. Let's pray.